Do you ever heard of a story of a king who fought entire 3 generations to give his country freedom? This is the story of Robert the Bruce, the Scottish king, and how he led Scotland to freedom. King Edward I of England was a fierce 13th century warrior king who was determined to conquer all of the British Isles. First, he battered the Welsh into submission. Then he set his sights on Scotland, laying siege to towns and castles and razing to the ground the communities that dared to resist him. He was even more brutal with the Scots who fought back, including the famous Sir William Wallace. He hunted them down and had them publicly tortured and executed. Only one Scottish lord eluded Edward Robert the Bruce, Earl of Carrick, who had somehow escaped to the remote fastness of northern Scotland. So Edward captured the rebels' family and friends, killing the men and imprisoning the women in cages. Bruce remained defiant. In 1306, he had himself crowned Scotland's king. Whatever it took, he vowed to revenge himself on Edward and throw the English out of Scotland. Hearing this, Edward became even more determined to capture this final piece in his Scottish wars, but in 1307, he died before the job was done. Edward's son, now Edward II, did not share his father's lust for war. Edward I had left the island secure. The new king did not have to worry about Scotland. England was far wealthier, and its armies were well-equipped, well-fed, well-paid, and experienced. In fact, their recent wars had made them the most feared fighters in Europe. At any moment, Edward II could field a great army against the Scots, whose weapons and armor were primitive. He felt confident that he could handle Robert the Bruce. A few months into the reign of Edward II, Bruce managed to take some Scottish castles held by the English and burn them to the ground. When Edward sent forces against him, Bruce refused to fight and fled with his small army into the forest. Edward sent more men to secure his remaining strongholds in Scotland and exact revenge on Bruce. But now Scots soldiers suddenly began to raid England. Highly mobile, these pirates on horseback devastated the northern English countryside, destroying crops and livestock. The English campaign in Scotland had become too costly, so it was called off. But a few years later, Edward tried again. This time, an English army penetrated farther into Scotland. But again, in response, Scottish raiders rode south into England, wreaking still more havoc on farms and property. And in Scotland itself, Bruce's army burned their own countrymen's crops, leaving the English invaders nothing to eat. As before, the English wore themselves out chasing Bruce, but to no avail. The Scots refused battle. Bivouacked in their camps, the English soldiers would hear bagpipes and horns out in the dark at night, making it impossible to sleep. Hungry, tired, and irritated to no end, they soon retreated back to northern England, only to find their own land barren of crops and cattle. Morale sank. No one wanted to fight in Scotland anymore. Slowly, one castle after another fell back into Scottish hands. In 1314, the Scots finally engaged in direct combat with the English at the Battle of Bannockburn, and, well, they defeated them. It was a most humiliating loss for Edward II, who swore to avenge it. In 1322, he decided to finish Bruce off once and for all with a vigorous campaign worthy of his father. Organizing and personally leading the largest army yet to fight the rebellious Scots, Edward got as far as Edinburgh Castle. At one point, he sent foragers out to look for food in the countryside. They returned with a single decrepit bull and an empty wagon. Dysentery swept the English troops. Edward was forced to retreat, and when he reached northern England, he saw that the Scots had once again razed the fields there, and more thoroughly than ever. Hunger and disease finished off the remnants of his army. The campaign was such a disaster that a rebellion broke out among Edward's lords. He fled, but in 1327 was captured and killed. The following year, Edward's son, Edward III, negotiated a peace with the Scots, granting Scotland its independence and recognizing Robert the Bruce as its rightful king.